Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 254 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Ronald Rolheiser has said that spirituality has to do with what we do with our longings. How does that line strike you? What are some of your own longings these days, and where do you take them? How do you connect the deep longings of your own soul with the real and gracious presence of God with you? This is what we're going to be talking about today as I discuss with my friend, Jeff Crosby, his new book, The Language of the Soul. You're going to find this episode especially timely, I think. Jeff Crosby is an organizational leader in the world of words, ideas, and book publishing. He's currently president and CEO of a trade association of publishers and has served in various executive roles, including as vice president at Ingram Book Company and at IVP, a publisher in the Chicago area. He combines a background in journalism, leadership studies, and business with a love of language and insight from several fields in exploring faith and spirituality in the light of applied practice. He and his wife of more than 40 years, Cindy, have 2 grown children and 6 grandchildren. Now, if you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. And if you find these episodes helpful, please follow, rate, and review, and be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Jeff Crosby. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Jeff Crosby, author of The Language of the Soul. Jeff, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation.
I appreciate you having me, Alan.
Yeah, well, I would love to start our conversation just asking if you could tell a little bit of the story of how this particular book came to be.
And it is more than 15 years in the making, Alan. I don't recommend necessarily that people take all of that time when they try to write a book, but it really goes back to encountering the word saudade, S-A-U-D-A-D-E. It's a Portuguese word. Encountering that in bossa nova and jazz music. I say in the book that though I've worked in the world of books all of my life, music is the language of my soul. And so this word, saudade, came to me through music mostly emanating out of Brazil, but other places in Latin America. Artists like João Gilberto and Yvonne Lins and many others. I would listen to this music and I would see this word and I wondered, what does it mean? I had never seen the word on paper before, but all of these songs by Stan Getz and others used it. And so I began exploring that word, and actually even longer than 15 years ago, because I recall the earliest exposure was in the pre-internet days, and I would go to the library and I began to do this search. I love words. I encounter a word. If I don't know what it means, I just have to stop and educate myself. And so ultimately, began to connect that word to an English word. Saudade is considered an untranslatable emotion. There is no English equivalent. But as I did study, as I reflected on it, I began to make a connection to our idea of longing. And then it was in 1998, I believe, that I read a book by Ronald Rolheiser called The Holy Longing. And in it, Rolheiser said, spirituality ultimately is about what we do with desire, what we do with our longings, both in terms of handling the pain and the hope they bring to us. That is our spirituality. And so the motivation for the book, how I came to write it, it was encountering a single word in Portuguese.
Yeah.
And then encountering Rolheiser's idea that what we do with our longing, both the hopes of it and the pain of it, that is our spirituality. And so I began writing. And in 2008, I first showed the book proposal to a woman named Phyllis Tickle that many people who work in publishing would know, readers would know her as the editor of the Divine Hours, and she was a dear friend. And Phyllis said, I wondered how long it would take you to write about that. And so then just took a lot of years reflecting, journaling, listening, dialogue with other people, reading books about desire by Jen Michelle's Teach Us to Want, or James K. Smith's You Are What You Love, and Desiring the Kingdom and others. And so just began to discern that while there are these other books out there covering holy longings, that perhaps there was room for one more. And so that's what became the language of the soul.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, so the subtitle of the book is Meeting God in the Longings of Our Hearts, to what you've just shared. And I think, that strikes me as the very best orientation to the deep desires of our hearts. But I think that we have different ways of dealing with longings in our cultural setting now. Can you maybe talk about some of the maybe less helpful approaches we sometimes take with addressing or dealing with our longings?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't raised in the church like probably many of your listeners were. But as I came as a teenager and a young adult to faith, I think that one of the early messages I got was actually about denial. It was, to ensure that I, maintained a faithfulness, that, there was an unhelpful teaching, or perhaps it was an unhelpful appropriation of the teaching on my part, that what is best is for us to deny ourselves. And so I think that I took that on. And I believe that as I reflect back on those years and then into my 20s and even early 30s, I sort of wanted to become the shell answer man, have an answer for every possible question that someone might pose to me, which is kind of antithetical to what I'm actually talking about in this book. So, anticipating arguments people might have, and very much an apologetics orientation, if you will. And I think that grew out of that, the teaching, or at least my appropriation of the teaching, and just to deny. Of course, there is another way of handling our desires or our longings, which is to give ourselves over to them in unhelpful ways. If I desire another person's spouse, there certainly there is no room for that in the life of a Christ follower. So, but I think that more of the people I encounter, particularly newer believers, it is that embrace of denying oneself. And I believe that these longings for home, for friendship, for transformation, for peace, for meaningful work, they are drivers in our lives, for good or for bad. And so, our task is to discern, which of these longings, or which of the pathways are we meeting God in the midst of them, and in which of them is it actually taking us further away? Is it leading to a disintegrated rather than integrated life?
Yeah, I appreciated in reading through your book, you've lived vocationally in the world of words, and you've, the life of the mind, if you want to oversimplify, that's certainly not. Music seems more the language of soul, the language of heart, the saudade, sort of language. I wonder if you can talk about that sort of life of the mind, life of the heart sort of interplay, maybe in your experience.
Yeah, and I think that the what I just said about the apologetics orientation, the shell answer man,
Yeah.
that was certainly a life of the mind, and there is definitely a place for that. There's a new book by Jessica Hooten Wilson called "Reading for the Love of God," and in her conclusion, she makes this beautiful argument of why reading is essential in the cultures in which we live, and reading deeply of literature, of theology, of philosophy, of scripture.
Yeah.
I still believe that. As you know, I've
Yeah.
worked in publishing and bookselling all of my adult life. And so I am a person of words, a person of the book. The integration of music for me came very, very early. It actually preceded a love of books. When I was in fifth grade, I was quite sickly, and my father, the greatest gift he ever gave me was during a long stretch when I could not go to school. I was confined to a bed. He brought home a little electric guitar. I think I write about it in the book, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, it rings a bell.
Brought home a little kind of starter electric guitar and a songbook, which I still have to this day. I don't know what happened to the guitar, but I do have the songbook, and it had songs of the day like Peace Train by Cat Stevens, or You've Got a Friend by James Taylor, or other classic songs of that era. That would have been about 1971, 72. And I taught myself to play laying in that bed. And so music was a very formative thing long before faith came along, and before books that I didn't have to read for school came along. And I think as I reflect back, what was it about music? It's there's something about it that not that books can't do this, but music for me, it touches a deeper place in my heart, a deeper place in my soul. It can, in 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, prick my conscience. It can cause me to remember something. It can prompt tears. It can prompt joy. And books do that too. But I would say that the two together are really, I think, for me, the secret sauce. And as I've been talking to people about the language of the soul, I'm finding that is not all that uncommon. In the book, as you may know, I list playlists at the end of each chapter.
Yeah.
And that's one of the curious things that I'm being asked a lot about. How did you choose those songs? Why not this one, or why not that one? Because other songs were the ones that, had they been writing this book, they would have chosen, because they're so meaningful and so memorable, and sort of they put a stamp on their life at a particular moment in time. So I think the two together are instrumental in many of our lives, and are ways in which we can be in touch with our thoughts, our histories, our feelings, our longings.
I really appreciate that. Well, as you begin the book, early on, you talk about one of the spiritual practices that has been meaningful for some time, and that's the practice of journaling. That's one that I share in common with you.
I know you do.
Yeah, and that it's been part of the gift of it has been the ability to discern what's happening in you, your longings, your desires, your feelings, whatever. Can you talk about that practice and how that comes into play sort of in your journey?
Yeah. I think I've really been tutored in the practice of journaling by my wife, Cindy, actually.
Oh.
Every time I get in the closet to get out a shirt or a sweater in the morning, I up on the top shelf, there are these large boxes. Cindy's journal 1 of 2, Cindy's journal 2 of 2. She has been a journaler all of her life, and I watched how that helped her to make sense of so much. And somewhere along the way, I picked up the practice as well. And oftentimes she and I write that, one of the three primary pathways. Journaling was one, reading the Psalms is another, and walks in nature. And the walks in nature also is something that Cindy and I share. And so oftentimes we will go on long hikes together of tall grass prairies, the native landscape of Illinois, or in the woods, or along shorelines of Lake Superior or elsewhere. And it is not uncommon that we both have journals tucked in our packs wherever we go, and we'll be together for a certain period of time, and then we'll peel off. Yeah. And we have, no matter where we are, we have certain places that, if we're returning, we have certain places we go, whether it's a bench or leaning up against a tree or what have you, where we will pause and pull out our journals, and we will listen both to the interior work going on as well as what we see around us. And that's, so it really came out of those, of watching her and seeing how that had carried her through some pretty difficult seasons.
Yeah.
And then also this shared practice of these hikes in the natural world, and then observing. One of her favorite poets is Mary Oliver, and I believe that there are a few lines from one of her poems that something to the effect of pay attention, be amazed, and tell others about it. I'm paraphrasing Mary Oliver through my wife here. But in many ways, that's kind of what I think we both do. And for me, as a lifelong writer, I studied journalism in college, as did she, and have always written, though this is the first full-length book of my own. Journaling is just, it's almost as natural as drinking a glass of water in the morning. It's the spiritual journaling that people like you, through the devotionals that you've done, have tutored me in the practice, or Luann Budd's Journal Keeping, another book that was just phenomenal, that was very much a tutor. So I think in particular times of distress and times of joy and celebration, the journal tends to be more, the pages are more filled on those poles of distress or pain, suffering, and then joy, wonder, celebration. On those two poles, it comes naturally. The in-between times, I may skip days, but
yes,
it's been very, very helpful discipline.
Well, it sounds like maybe similarly to the ways in which music taps into places of longing, places of inner life, that journaling is another way of becoming aware, discerning what's happening in you, how to make sense of what's happening around you.
Absolutely.
And so as we continue in the book, one of the longings in particular that you talk about is the longing for an undivided life.
Yeah.
And, that intersecting with longing, I wonder, what does an integrated life, an undivided life look like? And what are some ways that disintegration looks like?
Yeah. And boy, one of these days, if you haven't already done it, you should have Parker Palmer on your podcast, Alan, because he would be so much more eloquent about this than I. But it's his work really has been formational for me, and I write about that, even being on retreat with him and a few other people along a shoreline in Wisconsin. I think that an undivided life, in my experience, is where kind of the onstage life and the backstage life is not the same. And sadly, I would say that happens too often for me, and I suspect that I'm not alone. So I've been in leadership positions most of my adult life, and have been in touch with the reality that, the behind the scenes isn't always entirely congruous with the in front. And I think that comes from, placing expectations that others might have on myself when indeed they haven't placed it on me.
Yeah.
I've done it to myself. And so I think that an integrated life is where Parker Palmer talks about this Mobius strip. It's this, there's lots of writing on that. I think it comes out of a French mathematician, but this cylinder where you turn it and you realize the inside and the outside, it's actually the same. It's a matter of perspective, and that the longing is that we would be like that Mobius strip, that it's one continuous whole, it's one integrated whole. And I think for me, in seasons of great integration, which it's not as though that never happens, I'm just saying that sometimes it doesn't. In seasons of great integration, there is not this overarching sense of what are others thinking of me? How did she receive what I just said? I wonder what they're talking about. I wonder how they are processing what we just encountered in that meeting, or things like that. And so Parker has been a tremendous help. I've spent time with him in person, but much more so through his books. And so I continue to pursue that longing. I think that some changes that I've made in recent years have helped me to pursue it more intentionally, but it may indeed be a lifelong journey. And I think if you had him on and you asked him, Parker, do you ever arrive at a truly fully integrated life? He would likely say, no. It is a continual process until one passes on.
Yeah, that rings true. Well, maybe related to that, longing for, integration, longing for an undivided life, simplicity, whatever. Maybe part of that journey is you also write about longing for spiritual transformation, maybe in the direction of integration, in the direction of convergence. And what has helped you in that journey of spiritual transformation, whether it's practices or rhythms or perspectives or whatever?
Yeah. I think one of the early things was recognizing that moments of suffering, of pain, even of doubt, perhaps, can be dry tinder for spiritual transformation. I quote Howard Thurman, the great civil rights leader and Howard University and Boston University chaplain, and he talks about the jack pine trees, and it is out of the heat of the fire that will consume a jack pine forest that fresh trees emerge, and without the heat, that forest may well over time dissolve into nothingness. And so I think at some point along the way, I realized that spiritual transformation does not mean the absence of pain or the absence of grief or of doubt. And indeed, it may be in those seasons where it is catalyzed in the way the jack pine forest is. I think, though, two things in particular became very formational for me, and I believe you have some resources at Unhurried Living, or maybe you've had a podcast guest that talked about the daily exam, and that is one of them. There are a number of different people who have really opened that up for me. Marilyn McIntyre was one in particular, and Beth Borum and her husband David, who run a retreat center in Indianapolis. But the idea of daily, or nearly so, ideally doing it daily in the morning or the evening, being in touch with when we've sensed God's absence or God's presence, or when we've sensed desolation or consolation. And so I've been tutored through people and through resources, and that is a key one. I have engaged a spiritual director through a number of different seasons, and find that very helpful. I was quite nervous about it early on, and they're going to tell me what to do, and just kind of a misunderstanding.
Like heavy on the direction side of things or something.
Yes, as opposed to what it really became, which was the listening and the reflecting back what they were hearing, usually through questions. So that's been helpful. But the other, and I think I put even more emphasis on this, is reading of the Psalms. I remember when the pandemic of 2020 set in, that for the first time in my adult life, I found it difficult to read. Voracious reader as well as music listener. And in those early weeks, it was like I genuinely would pick up a book, and it was as if I was immobilized. And I still to this day don't know why. I couldn't make my way through. And then slowly some novels by Kent Haruf, Benediction and Eventide and Plainsong. So I turned to fiction, this particular writer, Kent Haruf, that I had read before, and I sort of unlocked the ability to read again. But the thing that I spent the majority of time was the Psalms. And I think it's because I instinctively realized that there was nothing that could be said that hasn't been said. There was no pain, no anguish, no question, no worry, no plea, no lament that the psalmist didn't express already.
Yeah.
And so I began reading the devotional Psalter that Dane Ortland married some meditations to the Psalms, and that became my companion. So I'm acknowledging that discipline is a 3-year discipline, whereas some of the other things we've talked about are much, much longer. But that has continued. The Psalms continue to be an element of that spiritual transformation. Certainly, reading other prayer books that I list a number of resources in the book. One reviewer said, it almost seems like you're being an evangelist for your industry of Christian publishing. And I hadn't thought about that, but I guess
that's funny.
In a certain way, all of the books that make their way into the list in the back or throughout the book, I guess I am being a little bit of a book evangelist here. But
Yes.
prayer books like John Bailey's Diary of Private Prayer or other things like that also were very helpful and have been for decades. So Lectio, doing retreats, writing my own prayers, the divine hours, other things as well are a part of this. But I would say the examine and the reading of Psalms and of prayers are kind of lead the way and light the darkness, if you will.
Well, I certainly resonate with the reading of the praying of the Psalms. That both of us have something of a liturgical experience in our worship. And for me, the Book of Common Prayer and the daily praying of the Psalms, you couldn't have a better opportunity to learn about your longings than the daily engagement with the Psalms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I was, as I read through one of your later chapters, you talk about the longing for peace. And I loved this little quotation. You say, in the whirlwind of Western existence, with its emphasis on speed, productivity, and technology, I'm convinced that we all long for a measure of slowness and peace, even if we live most of our lives without acknowledging it. I wonder if you could say more about that. I really resonated with it.
Yeah, I'm glad you resonated with it, and I had forgotten that was in there, but I do believe what I wrote. And it actually ties very much into we've been talking about the importance of reading. I think reading slows us down in a way that other things we can do with our time doesn't. In the book that I referenced earlier, Reading for the Love of God by Jessica Hooten Wilson, the subtitle is How to Read as a Spiritual Practice. I love what she writes in the book's conclusion. And I just read this over the last week, but it ties very much into the question I think that you have posed. Jessica writes in the opening lines of the conclusion, in the midst of chaos and noise, the call to read may sound silly. Don't we need to be improving the world, fighting injustice, stopping wars, curing illness, feeding the poor? Yes, of course. I believe in the need for beautification, revolution, and acts of mercy. However, we must imagine the ends that we are fighting for. Reading well encourages us to join these impermanent battles, to see the good causes from the evil machinations, and to know truth from falsehood. A pious person who spends time reading great books well has more resources needed to act wisely in an impious age. Opening a book should not be the final goal, but the invitation to a broader vision. And I love that, and the countercultural message that she has there. And I just think that the speed at which we are in the West are either asked to move at, the speed at which we ask ourselves to move in order to be seen as productive, helpful, engaged in the causes and the concerns of the day. I think we're wearing ourselves out.
Yeah.
We're wearing each other out. And so that's where this notion that you captured in that sentence, that we long for a measure of this, even if we don't acknowledge it. And I think that if even a few people, as you did, read and resonate with that and say, what would it look like to get out of that whirlwind? What would it look like to have a measure of slowness? I mean, my goodness, that's what you're doing for all of us through Unhurried Living, and what Jim is doing. And so, so I'm glad you resonated with it. I believe it deeply, and I believe with all my heart that reading is a part of what helps us to slow down. I mean, we can read books quickly, but I think that reading as a spiritual practice will cause us to slow down and to ponder before we move forward into the concerns of the day. At least that's my hope. I'm still idealistic about that, I suppose.
Well, I certainly resonate with that. And I find, it's not the same if you're speed reading a book, but if you're sinking in to join the author in what they're thinking and what they're saying, and letting your inner life resonate with it, there is something about that as a slowing practice. That's been my experience too. And I think maybe the other thing, the other connection I'm making is, it has been in slowing down a bit in the various ways we've sought to do that I've become more aware of my longings. It's like the have to, need to, should of my hurried ways in the past had a way of covering up the true longings of how God made me. Yeah. And so I think, that's an intersection that I notice. So you continue one other chapter I wanted to touch. You talk about the longing for meaningful work. And in there, you talk about this common and not particularly helpful dualism between what some will call sacred work and secular work. Can you talk about this, especially when it comes to, the kind of work that we long to do, whether or not that work is particularly religious, by definition?
Yeah. Yeah, reflect in that chapter on being at a camp, a father-daughter camp with a whole bunch of very, very successful people, all men. It was father-daughter at camp, and I was bunking up with 20 or so other men, and by all outward appearances, they were far more successful than this small Midwestern publisher that I was. Dentists and airline pilots and doctors and veterinarians, and but over the course of the evenings together, almost all of them were lamenting the work that they did. They were lamenting how they spent their days. And I remember thinking in my mind, I hope I didn't say it to them, but reflecting on an Annie Dillard quote, and I think it's in The Writing Life, where she says, don't you understand, how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. But I think that they had bought, as Christian fathers, they had bought into this dichotomy that their work was secular and therefore was not meaningful to God. And I was a younger father at the time. Many of them were a bit older than I was, and I don't have a clear memory of what I said in response. But what I hope I contributed to that is that all work that we do can and should be seen as meaningful to God. And the way in which we treat employees, if we're a leader of a Fortune 500 company, or how we care for our neighbors, what we do in terms of the environment, on and on and on. There are ways in which our Christian values and our Christian convictions and how God has wired us and made us as women and men in his image can be brought to bear on that work. I do think the church has, throughout history, sort of taught this dichotomy. I think that has begun to change, thankfully. Writers like Steve Garber and his book Visions of Vocation have really challenged that dualism. But and in my own life, I left journalism fairly early on after college because I felt a sense of calling to reopen a Christian bookstore near Indiana University. And that's what my wife and I did. That's how we started in what has become my lifetime vocation of working with words. But you know what? I could have stayed as a sports editor of that small town daily newspaper and been a believer in that role and done good work, and God would have smiled down as I occasionally covered the Cincinnati Reds at Riverfront Stadium. So thankfully this is beginning to change, but there's still some work that we can do. What constitutes meaningful work? I think that George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, it's good to go back and watch that every year and be reminded of what a true meaningful life and meaningful work is all about.
Yeah, I really love that. I came up as a young Christian teenager in a setting where the ideal was, if you really want to serve God, well, then you need to go into full-time vocational ministry, and so that's what I want then, I guess. This is what I'm going to do. But like you, over time, I've really begun to think those who live their leadership and live their work in non-religious settings have a beautiful opportunity to, be a sort of kingdom outpost, that there are things Jesus wants to do in and through each of us wherever we find ourselves. And that would be an awfully meaningful thing, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, as we bring our conversation to a close, Jeff, I wonder, could I ask you just to, share a word of encouragement with our listeners, kind of in the spirit of this book that you've written?
Yeah. Well, I think that I'll point a little of the encouragement to you and Unhurried Living as I began. I'm just so grateful for what you and Jim are doing through the ministry that you have, for the ways in which it has touched me for a number of years now, from the first time I read the manuscript of An Unhurried Life. But to all of your listeners, I would just encourage you to continue to engage in resources like what Alan and Jim have drawn together, and to take time to whatever your mode is. It may not be journaling, it may not be walks in nature or reading of the Psalms, but whatever that sacred pathway is, to quote Gary Thomas's great book, devote time to that. Don't shortchange that. And as you walk down that sacred pathway yourself, take time to try to be in touch with the longings that you have, and understand that that desire does not equal bad. Desire does not equal discontent.
Yeah.
We are hardwired as human persons with desire. And I believe that God meets us in the midst of that. Our role is to be attentive to the ways in which God is doing that.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, again, my guest today has been Jeff Crosby, and we've been talking about his book, The Language of the Soul, Meeting God in the Longings of Our Hearts. Jeff, it's really been such a pleasure to have this visit.
Thanks for having me on.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. In the next few episodes, we'll be talking with authors Kyle Idleman, Sean Nemechek, and Joe Saxton. I can't wait to share those with you. If you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.